I'm Henry Bonsu, and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's got you talking in social media and beyond. Joining me today are Chidi Oti Obihara, former parliamentary candidate for the Green Party, the International Relations Advisor Madeleine Young, and Stephen Wolfe, independent member of the European Parliament. Thank you very much for coming in. Very nice to see you indeed. Now, the International Criminal Court has been controversial from the start. Established in 2002 in The Hague, it was set up to prosecute individuals for war crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity. Now, some claim it's a beacon of hope for those denied justice in their own countries, but others say the overrepresentation of African defendants shows that the ICC is a tool of imperialist powers. Unlike 120 other countries, the US never ratified the Rome Statute that established the court. Now, in a searing speech, Donald Trump's National Security Advisor John Bolton has said the International Criminal Court is illegitimate and dead to us. He also threatened ICC officials and prosecutors with sanctions, including being denied entry to the US. The timing of his words come as no surprise, though. The court is getting ready to investigate allegations that American soldiers based in Afghanistan inflicted horrendous abuse on their detainees. So what should happen to the ICC? Should it be scrapped and replaced? Or is it now time for its defenders to rally round and protect it from the US and its other enemies? OK, before we get the initial thoughts of our panel, let's hear exactly what Bolton said and how he said it.
The United States will use any means necessary to protect our citizens and those of our allies from unjust prosecution by this illegitimate court. We will not cooperate with the ICC. We will provide no assistance to the ICC. And we certainly will not join the ICC. We will let the ICC die on its own. After all, for all intents and purposes, the ICC is already dead to us.
John Bolton there, not mincing his words. Let's go to the panel. Stephen Wolfe. Steve, we're going to start off with you. You've got a legal background. What do you make of that? Because he's very, very clear. It should have no jurisdiction over US citizens. What do you think?
Well, I think that what John Bolton is doing is simply echoing what's happened in the United States since Bill Clinton signed initially agreement to join the Rome Treaty, but was then knowing in the fact that it would be denied actually ratification by Congress and the Senate. And that is because it goes fundamentally down to something in the depths of the hearts and souls of people of the United States. And that is, since 1776, no international organization or nation could influence or control the United States people unless it's been voted on by those people. And so
what he's saying then is constitutionally correct?
I think that's exactly part of who they are. Now, of course, every country gives away an element of sovereignty, but even membership of the United Nations and other organizations has never allowed a policy-making decision to be implemented into the United States without those people. So I think he can say this on firm ground, intellectually and philosophically. But I think this is more than that. It's not just simply that. This is about the fact that they don't want to have any American soldiers or military ever to be facing the prosecution because of the actions they do overseas. So
because they know that the ICC is looking at what went on in Afghanistan, not just at alleged Taliban crimes, but also at alleged crimes by American soldiers.
Certainly, and I think if they allowed this to happen, the detrimental and negative impact on the military in the United States would have a massive ramification against Trump, because a huge amount of his support is the military. He's spent billions preparing and working with the military, whether it's in their hospitals or giving them education or the kind of equipment they need going forward. He's seen as a big defender of the military, and this fits in with their overall Trump strategy. All
right, Madeleine, what about you? What do you think? Because we all talk loosely, both in the studio and outside, about international law. But what is international law if it's not a number of countries coming together to agree to pool their sovereignty and decide what is conscionable and what is not? Doesn't this undermine, in a pretty devastating way, the ICC? Doesn't it undermine international law?
I think that's a fantastic question. And as a person, you might hear from my accent, who's grown up in the United States, I have some pretty strong feelings about this decision by John Bolton. And John Bolton, who started these kind of decision-making moves when he was working for George W. Bush as an undersecretary. He personally has sought to undermine the ICC's authority over U.S. officials for a very long time and was very proud of his achievements under George W. Bush.
That's right. He signed a series of bilateral deals with about 100 countries to make sure that they could not extradite or they could not put the U.S. citizens in the jurisdiction of the ICC.
Yeah, so basically he was very keen to disempower any country to hold American officials accountable for any war crimes. So we're talking about crimes against humanity. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about organized sexual violence, gender-based violence. This is really, really serious, and it's something that everyone on the planet should be concerned by. Crimes against children, crimes against families, crimes against pregnant women, any kind of violence against civilians that's organized, planned, and executed with no accountability is, in a way, undermines any kind of international community that we might want to build. And unfortunately, the United States, and I'm saying this from my own experience, my own education, has had some difficulties on its own soil in terms of justice and reparation towards Native American people. The country was founded on displacement of Native American people and crimes against the African diaspora who were trafficked into the U.S. into slavery. And I feel that the current administration's move shows a blindness to the historic realities of the United States within the country and its type of policies within the country are reflected in its behavior towards the international community. Now, while the U.S. has supported cases against Afghanistan and Sudan with the ICC, right? That's happened.
This is the odd thing, isn't it?
Right.
I guess, Chidi, as a Green, I'm assuming you're an internationalist, therefore you support the ICC with all its flaws. And when you heard John Bolton denouncing it as illegitimate and dead, you were hit in the gut, I'm guessing.
Thank you for that, Henry.
It's a leading question, but I'm just guessing.
No, I wasn't hit in the gut. And the reason why I wasn't hit in the gut is that it doesn't tell me anything new about John Bolton.
Yeah.
The man who masterminded the unsigning of the treaty that was supposed to make the US responsible for its actions under the ICC, and the man who's consistently backed the American Service Members Protection Act is not going to be the man who's going to come around and give a bear hug to members of the ICC who turn around and say they want to investigate specific crimes carried out by the US. My position as a Green and as an internationalist is that I fully support the ICC. I mean, it hasn't had the best of starts. It's been accused rightly of focusing too much on the mishaps that African leaders have gotten into and the crimes they've committed, to be fair.
I'm watching the face of Stephen Wolf very carefully. He's got you in his sights. Go on.
Well, we want a much, much broader remit for the ICC. You can't really, in this modern age, talk about genocide, crimes against humanity, wars of aggression alone. If you're looking after the criminal interest or the interests of people across the world, you want to stop crimes being committed against them, you have to think about pollution and things that kill people other than just governments. And so I would push the ICC even broader and even further, and I would not be perturbed by people like Bolton, who have just been consistent.
Quick response from Steve, because he was looking at you.
Well, I just think the International Criminal Court was certainly there, in my view, to look after the people who've been abused in cases of genocide and people trafficking. But I do find it really concerning that you then start to consider the idea that you've got pollution or environmental crimes being undertaken under a criminal court as well. This is about effectively moving law up the ladder to a world court and towards the idea of a world state.
Yeah.
You know, and that to me would be catastrophic. I mean, I've watched too many movies from Arnold Schwarzenegger's battles to try and keep the people out of kind of robots, and too many of these type of movies to suggest that when you get organisations at the very top, they don't always act at the interests of the people at the
I know Chidi wants to come back, and so does Madeline, but we'll let you do that in just a moment or two. But we want to develop this a little bit, because it's not just in the US where the ICC is under attack, not even just in the studio. Several African countries, including Uganda, Burundi and Sudan, whose president was indicted by the court, have all condemned it. South Africa has even tabled legislation in advance of a possible withdrawal. So should the African Union make common cause with the US? Joining us via Skype is Angela Mudukuti. She's an international criminal justice lawyer at the Wayamo Foundation, which aims to promote justice and the rule of law, and it's based in Berlin. Angela, hello. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, how significant is this US move against the ICC, especially in the way in which it was denounced by John Bolton?
I think it is quite significant because he's upped the ante, so to speak, including, as you've already discussed, discussing sanctions against ICC employees and the judges, etc., which is new. But given previous behavior from the US government, we can't be too surprised. However, I think that we need to be very much aware and vigilant and to make sure that the ICC is supported and protected by its member states and that this attack is not left unchecked.
In what way could they support it? In what way could they bolster it, given how a US refusal to engage with the ICC, perhaps refuse to share intelligence, could damage current and future investigations?
Well, I mean, the extent to which the US has been cooperating with the ICC in terms of investigations is, of course, a matter only the ICC and the US would know. So I don't think we should overstate the help that the US has given to the ICC to date. I think the ICC has 123 signatories who support the court, and that those states need to be active, need to speak out, as many have done in the wake of John Bolton's speech, and say that, yes, the court is not perfect, but nations need to support it financially and also when it counts, which means speaking up for it now when it's under attack.
What about the concern that the ICC delivers selective justice? Of all the cases that it's investigated, there are 37 named defendants, all African, and 10 of the 11 cases, the investigations, involve Africans, Africa.
Yes, and this is a criticism that's brought against the court, and I think with good reason, because we would encourage universal application of international criminal justice. But let's look carefully at how these situations came before the International Criminal Court. We have 5 self-referrals from Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, 2 from Central African Republic, and then Mali. So this is African nations making use of the court they helped create. There would be no ICC were it not for the regional bloc of signatories from the African continent. The African continent constitutes the largest regional bloc with 33 signatories. So first of all, we were involved in its inception and we fought for the independence of the Office of the Prosecutor. And now we see nations making use of the court they helped create. So the self-referral element mustn't be ignored. And I think it's often ignored when people talk about the ICC attacking or targeting Africa, so to speak. And then, of course, we have the United Nations Security Council referral, Libya and Sudan, 2 situations that came from a highly political body and, of course, involving African states. So I think the statistics don't support the allegation that the ICC is targeting Africa. But again, absolutely, justice needs to be applied universally. But just because we cannot go for everyone does not mean we can ignore the criminals that fall within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court.
I mean, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Rome Statute, and there's been a lot of discussion online over whether or not the ICC's failures outweigh its successes. What would you say?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer because the ICC is a relatively young institution if you think about it. The Rome Statute was signed in 1998 and the court became operational in around 2000, 2002. So we don't have a lot to go by, and I would say in the years that it's worked, they've had some successes, some convictions. They provided an element of deterrence and justice for victims. A lot of work to do, and there are many, many issues that can be addressed by the court, and they need to improve in many areas. But I would say that from a balanced perspective, the court has had some successes, but there are challenges that remain unaddressed.
So the successes in the convictions or prosecutions of the likes of Jean-Pierre Bemba for activities in the Central African Republic, got Thomas Lubango from DRC, Baska Untaganga, Congo as well. Are they the successes you're thinking of? Because there aren't that many.
I think we need to remember that there are millions of victims behind all of these convictions that you've mentioned, and not to mention the deterrence factor. Think of the alternative, a world without an international permanent court. I think then we would see far greater atrocities and no right to recourse, especially because the ICC is designed as a court of last resort, meaning that domestic jurisdictions have jurisdictional primacy. And right now, when we look at the African continent, a lot of domestic systems are not in a position to try their own heads of state, for example. And then we go to the regional level. We don't have a regional court of criminal jurisdiction. And that's why the International Criminal Court remains essential. As flawed as it is, it remains essential, and we should constructively build it instead of trying to tear it down.
How concerned would you be if legislation currently sitting in the South African Parliament is approved and South Africa does pull out of the ICC, after everything Mandela and others did to set it up?
Yes, that would indeed be a travesty, because South Africa was instrumental in gathering the Southern African states and ensuring that the ICC had the support of Southern African states. And as you said, the history of South Africa itself, apartheid is a crime under the Rome Statute. And unfortunately, the International Criminal Court wasn't in existence at the time that apartheid took place. But now we have a court that could potentially, should anything like that ever happen again, a court that could potentially deal with these matters. And for South Africa, with its history, to leave the only permanent International Criminal Court, I think this sends a very, very poor message and is not good for accountability, is not good for the rule of law, and is quite frankly not good for South Africans as individuals and as a government.
Angela Mudukuti from the Wayamo Foundation in Berlin, thank you very much. Vielen Dank for joining us. Okay, panel, you need to follow that up with gusto and clarity. Madeleine, what do you make of that? Because she gave a very, very robust defence of the ICC, more successes than failures.
I'd like 2 points here. One, on Angela's commentary, fantastic, and it really is about opening dialogue, starting to have an international criminal court, and there will be teething issues, so to speak. I feel that criticism within the African continent can be justified, can be understood, because it's looking inward. It's the ICC's international. Why is it Africa? Why is it African states utilizing it?
But as you said, it's African states referring cases to the ICC because they can't deal with them themselves. Or you have special courts for Sierra Leone and others.
Which is fantastic. And I think it's also understandable that Africa would find that a problem, that only we are accountable to the ICC, and that is legitimate. Now, the U.S. saying, don't try to hold us accountable for anything that we've done all over the world. We're allowed to go wherever we want. We can do whatever we want in any country, destroy infrastructure, cause massive devastation, and we have no accountability to anyone, not even one court, not even one case, and they're upset. And that I find problematic. I can understand you being upset, being held accountable repeatedly. If you've never been held accountable, then there's an issue. And on the issue of business ethics, for example, pollution, if pollution, for example, is a business crime, and as a person who studies business ethics, I think it's very important that there would be a mechanism for, let's say, a massive maritime accident, another Exxon Valdez spill.
Or even like a trafigura off the coast of Africa.
Yes.
Yeah, West Africa.
And when it comes to international jurisdiction, who is held accountable and where?
Some support for your thoughts there, Chidi?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Madeleine. When I was listening to Ms. Mudukuti speaking, she mentioned the fact that there was a risk that it would be seen as selective, and then simultaneously said that there statistically wasn't any evidence, which contradicted what she said earlier on. All the convictions we've seen at the ICC have been of African leaders. So it is perceived, not just in terms of attempts, but in terms of outcomes, it's perceived as being selective. And that is a problem. That is a problem in terms of enforcement. But in terms of the broader issue about what this court is supposed to do, the deterrence factor that's needed in terms of genocidal acts by non-government players means that things like pollution need to be considered in this wider remit. The way the Rome Statute was written allows, actually, there are no statutes of limitations, so allows the ICC to do so without changing any of its core statutes. But one of the core things I would remind everyone of here is that the American Service Members Protection Act, which is a 2001 act, I think, actually allows, it's called the Hague Invasion Act, actually allows John Bolton to do and execute everything he's threatened to do so far.
With impunity.
With impunity. There's actually no law stopping him from being quite aggressive towards judges at the ICC, because he has, as it stands, domestic statute in the States that gives him the power to do so. Now, if we spend all of our time arguing about a domestic American politician restating American law, granted in aggressive language, we know, but if we spend all of our time looking at that and looking at the broader international criminal issues, we are missing the point.
We're missing the point, Steve.
Well, the fundamental elements about this is about legitimacy and also who defines this. One of the biggest criticisms that I have with the International Criminal Court is that it is essentially a political vehicle. You have a single prosecutor who has the power to make those decisions.
An African woman at the moment, Fatou Bensouda, she's got a team around her.
She has a team around her, they make the decisions of who they're going for. And the political decision is that when they're rubbing up against the people in the UN Council, they're not really going up against China, they're not really going up with the United Kingdom or Germany or France or any of the other permanent members as well. For me, it's about picking on the smallest and easiest targets. And for that, that's why they seem to have gone into Africa. And the second point is, it seems to say that Africa can't deal with it themselves. And that, in a way...
It sounds bad, but I mean, the evidence is
there. But it also sounds quite racist.
Well, let me stop you on that thought. We may come back to it, because we want to deal with some social media. Maybe people might flag up racism in this. Let's see. Here's what you've been saying on Twitter. First of all, Jamil says, "We won't prosecute war criminals, but we will prosecute those who prosecute them." No joke. This is now US policy. Sam says, "John Bolton, the guy who has facilitated or backed every US invasion or bombing for decades. Bolton shouldn't be talking about the International Criminal Court. He should be a target of it." And then Disha says, "The ICC is just a tool used for meddling in the affairs of African states. It fails miserably on issues of international justice." And then let's move to Facebook, starting with Alexa, who says, "The ICC isn't just for African dictators. It should operate on its founding principles and pursue justice in cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. American exceptionalism does not supersede fundamental human rights." And finally, Glib, who says, "In sum, an international court so deeply flawed can have no legitimate claim to jurisdiction over the citizens of sovereign nations that have rejected its authority." Now remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram by using the handle DoublingDownTV. Well, 20 years after the signing of the Rome Statute, there's evidence that the ICC is, and you guys might be happy about this, widening its focus. Not only is the court about to authorize an investigation into alleged crimes committed in Afghanistan, it's also considering a referral from the Palestinian administration on alleged abuses committed in the occupied West Bank. And as the ICC's Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda has been explaining, its attention has been drawn to the situation in Myanmar.
The preliminary examination may take into account a number of alleged coercive acts having resulted in the forced displacement of the Rohingya people. This includes deprivation of fundamental rights, killing, sexual violence, enforced disappearance, destruction, and looting. My office will further consider whether other crimes under Article 7 of the Rome Statute may be applicable, such as the crimes of persecution and other inhumane acts.
Fatou Bensouda, the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC. So, panel, I'm just wondering, are you reassured that this is a maturing institution that is broadening its perspective? Chidi's smiling at me warmly, so I'll go to you.
No problem. It was really great to see Fatou talking about the next assignment she's taking on, not just Palestine, but the Rohingya problem. One of the things that strikes me about this is that we all want, well, I certainly want the ICC to have a clear and focused mandate and run as far forward as possible dealing with these criminal issues. But the key problem is the politicization of the process. Fatou actually announced her intention to prosecute the Americans for their actions in Afghanistan in November of last year. 10 months later, we're having a conversation 10 weeks before the US midterms where Mr. Bolton is parroting really very well-worn lines that the Republican Party have always had since the beginning of ICC to as loud an audience as possible, because he wants to bring this to the fore. He wants to bring his established anti-ICC position to the fore just before the midterms.
So the people have got it in mind when they
absolutely,
go to vote.
When people are distracted by sex scandals, the Kavanaugh scandal, a whole bunch of trouble happening in the White House. And I think that this politicization of the ICC in this domestic context is really, really poor.
We've got some closing thoughts. Madeleine, your closing thoughts on this. How do you see things going forward for the ICC?
I think it's quite exciting. The objective of these sort of courts, one, is if we can prosecute people and get convictions, that if they're appropriate, that's fantastic. One of the objectives is also dialogue. And so some of the international initiatives, like for example, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, doesn't necessarily directly result in what it's obtaining to do, but the dialogue, allowing people to talk, allowing people to have a voice and listen and raising awareness.
So even if they sign but don't necessarily implement it straight away?
If we have a conversation about what's going on in Myanmar, if we have a conversation about what's going on in the West Bank, we talk about really painful issues and let people voice their concerns and voice the suffering that they've had, that starts to see things change. You're shedding light on things that have been in the dark or they've been localized, and we need to talk about that. And I think it's very important, even if it doesn't result in convictions, and the United States needs to hold itself as part of that. Black Lives Matter, for example.
All right. And Stephen, I'm going to throw this at you, this quote, to trigger your final thought. It was Bill Clinton, former President of the United States, who once said, "Mend it, don't end it." What say you? Tell John Bolton that when you see him.
Well, I would say that King Charles I in 1648 said before his trial, said, would I know by what power am I called before this court? And I think that fundamentally is one of the big issues of this court. It's 20 years in. It doesn't have universal jurisdiction. It doesn't have clarity over definitions. It's being pulled by politics of the left and the right. Yeah. It's targeting the weakest rather than the strongest. And like many institutions that start off with really valuable and important ideals, such as stopping genocide and dealing with those criminals, it also gets to the end of its tether when it's not working, like the League of Nations, like the gold standard, like Bretton Woods. I think this is a court that needs to go away, end, and rethink how we do this properly in the modern world, not in its current format.
And there you have landed. Thank you very much indeed. And that's it for this week. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Stephen Wolfe, Madeline Young, and Chidi Oti Obihara. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.